Hey everyone, Socialism and Left. I have here Victor Magarino. Would you like to introduce yourself? So maybe you could tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you.
Yeah, so, well, my name is Victor Magarino. I am a student of economics and philosophy at NYU Shanghai. Right now, I'm in Madrid, but for next semester, if I get the visa on time, I will be flying back to Shanghai. And well, what I do here in YouTube is I talk about economics, I talk about philosophy, but I like to speak mainly about economics. And well, so I identify myself as a Marxist. So I obviously speak a lot from the standpoint of the Marxist school of economics as well as the classical school of economics, since the Marxist is a development of the
Hmm.
classical school. And you can find me in YouTube if you type in Victor Magarino, my name, my channel will be right there.
Sure. So we've got who you are, we got where you can go. Oh, actually, I should send a link for people who'd like to subscribe to you. Let me just get your YouTube link. Victor. If you'd like to subscribe to Victor, and from what I can tell, his videos are reasonably high quality, that's the link. Um, so, why don't we I suppose not only this was like supposed to be a debate or something. Would you like to outline what your position on the labor theory of value is, and why, like, what you think the strongest evidences are in its favor, something along those lines?
Perfect. Yeah. So, so the labor theory of value, right, is this really messy concept that encompasses, depending on who you speak to, a wide variety of things, right? But when I speak about the labor theory of value, I like to speak about it in the terms of the theory that tries to explain the proportion in which commodities exchange in capitalist societies that was initially developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and that was later taken up by Marx and further extended, even though a big part of the work was already done before him. Now, this theory, so one of the things that we need to do, obviously, is try to define, as it were, the basic terminology, because if we don't agree on the basic terminology, there's not ground for a productive conversation already. So the labor theory of value starts, and different schools have different definitions of value. Okay, so what I'm going to outline is particularly my tradition of economic thinking's conception of value, and then if you want to contrast it with another one, we can. But so we start with value. Actually, even before we start with value, let's start with use value and with exchange value, right? So commodities in capitalist societies are what Marx says are the what constitute the material wealth of modern industrial capitalist societies. And the reason for this is because
Wake up,
they have
liberal.
a certain
Hello?
set of properties. And one of these properties is that they have a quantitative worth, right? So commodities, apart from being useful objects, they are objects that, for some reason or another, we don't really care at at this analytical stage what particular utility they serve. Um, but they are objects that have a certain use value to them, and they are objects that can be exchanged. They have a property of commensurability. And when you look at these commodities and you look at the way in which they exchange, initially it seems as if this exchange value, and Marx notes this, as if it were a matter of whim, as if it were arbitrary, right? As if there was some as if it just happened that way. But it doesn't really happen this way. So we want to understand what is the underlying, let's say, thing, what is the underlying um, property that all of these commodities have in common. That is what ultimately determines this exchange value. So the fundamental exchange value of commodities in the market. And what is it basically that regulates relative prices in commodities? So first, what is exchange value? Well, exchange value can refer at first at the property of commensurability, so at the property that commodities have of being able to be exchanged against other commodities, and all commodities have this property, right? And then otherwise they wouldn't be commodities. And then we can also be speaking about the proportion in which these commodities exchange against one another in the market, right? So this could be, in a more colloquial manner, we could speak about their price. And their price can be expressed in many different manners. So the price of 1 kilogram of wheat can be expressed in terms of iron, in terms of gold, in terms of silver, in many different terms, or in modern capitalist societies in terms of fiat money. But what we really want to see is what is it that really determines this proportion. And what we point to at the beginning of our analysis is to labor times, to the amount of time that is socially necessary to produce these commodities. And the reason for this is because in exchange, commodities are treated as qualitatively equal but quantitatively the same. And all commodities, as far as they are the product of labor, are qualitatively equal but quantitatively different, because
Hmm.
different commodities require different amount of labor time to be produced. So then the theory, okay, proposes this idea that at a more abstract analytical stage, it proposes the idea that commodities, the relative prices of commodities, are going to be directly proportional to relative labor times. So they're going to be equal. So individual prices are going to be proportional to individual labor times. Okay.
Sure. So just to briefly step in, I believe the brief summary that was given of this is that, for example, in Adam Smith's very like a primitive society, that if
Mm-hmm.
it took 2 hours to produce like a beaver pelt and it took 1 hour to produce like a pound of venison, then the exchange price between the two would be 1 to 2 because it would take 1 hour to produce one and 2 to produce the other. So the
Yes.
relative price is equal to the labor, like relative labor ratio of labor.
Yes, yes. So that is at an initial analytical stage what the theory says.
Mm-hmm.
But this is something that but there is another factor. So there's different levels of concretion that you need to reach, as in any other scientific procedure, right? To understand
Mm-hmm.
any other phenomena, you need to start from more abstract settings into more concrete ones. And at a more concrete level, we see that there is a systematic deviation between relative prices of production, or relative natural prices, which this is
Mm-hmm.
another concept that now I'm going to explain, and relative labor times. So, in a simple, as you described, in a simple economy, in simple commodity production, the law is basically the following: is relative labor times are going to be equal to relative prices, and there is going to be an arbitrage process through competition that guarantees that this is the case. So that
Mm-hmm.
if one price goes up, then there is going to be more movement of producers into that industry, which is going to bring the price down, and the other price relatively up again because of the simple supply and demand dynamics. And then they are going to meet again at a point where the incomes per hour for the producers, for the simple producers, are equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this turbulent equalization of incomes per hour. But if you introduce class, and this is something that Adam Smith already does, if you introduce class into the picture and you divide now total aggregate product, you divide it between wages and profits, now you include another factor, and initially this factor doesn't alter the story so long as each industry requires the same amount of capital, the same amount of labor to produce whatever commodity they need, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if there are differences in organic compositions of capital, so in the ratio of constant capital to variable capital between industries, then algebraically you can see this, and this is something that can be shown perfectly well. There is going to be a systematic deviation, and this is part of the transformation problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's now a transformation procedure that comes into the picture, uh, and the problem is easily solved through an iterative process. But okay, so then there's this systematic deviation that changes a little bit the story, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really alter it to the extent where it makes it unsound, because now the story changes to relative labor times are going to be what what the structural elements, so what mainly determines relative prices of production, and relative prices of production,
Mm-hmm.
which are the prices that lead to equal profit rates, in the same way that before they led to equal incomes per hour, now they lead to equal profit rates.
Mm-hmm.
And that price of production are going to be the centers of gravity of market prices, so
Yep.
what regulate market prices.
Yeah, and I mean, so far, I basically agree with this description of the labor theory of value. So I think you're totally right to describe it as that. What so now that we've got like a brief understanding of the theory, what would you consider like either a strong theoretical, since you wanted to focus on that first, or empirical argument if you want to get into that for believing that labor is in fact the fundamental component by which commodities would be like co-valued, which they would be co-measured.
Yeah, so here I think we can get to the empirical evidence already. And although I'm not going to be able to show you the empirical evidence, I'm going to discuss it. And whoever wants me to link the studies or whatever, I will always be glad to link them to you. In fact, if you want, after this conversation, we can even link them in this
Mm-hmm.
conversation. So there are three main hypotheses that are already drawn from these three main hypotheses that are drawn. So any scientific theory using more modern conception of the philosophy of science. So any scientific theory needs to produce a set of hypotheses that need to be testable, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need a hypothetical deductive method by which you bring about certain hypotheses that then you can test against the empirical world. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so which are three of these hypotheses? On the one hand, we have a cross-sectional hypothesis, which
Yep.
says that in any given input-output year, so the way in which these empirical studies are carried out is by looking at input-output tables that were first available during the Soviet Union and were popularized by Leontiev, who
Mm-hmm.
was then an person that won a Nobel Prize and so on. And these input-output tables allow us to conduct a set of tests. And the first test is a cross-sectional one. So if you look at any given input-output year, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you compute prices of production based on the model, which takes an algebraic form, which is the one that I haven't been able to show, but whoever wants to see it, they can.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see these prices of production. You compute them. You look at market prices. You look at labor times at vertically integrated, so they are direct and indirect labor times
Mm-hmm.
required for the production of a given commodity in a given industry. You look at all the industries, and normally, depending on the country, you will find more or less industries depending on how they named them, depending on the available data, depending on many things. But in Spain, for example, for the year 2016, they
Mm-hmm.
have 64 industries, so you get a sense of how many industries we're speaking about, 64 at least. And then you compute this, and using the mean absolute weighted deviation, which is a measure of dispersion between
Mm-hmm.
vectors, you compute these differences, the difference between the vector of prices of production, the vector of market prices, and the vector of market prices and labor values, and markets of and price of production and labor values, and you look at these differences, and the theory predicts that these differences are going to be very small. Okay, very
Yeah.
small. And if you look at the data, indeed, they are very small. They are in the order of 7%, something like that, 10%,
So,
maybe
for
less.
example, this is like a very common argument. It was first proposed by Scheik, and in fact, I watched through one of your videos and I saw that you cited Table 15.1 from Scheik's 1998 publication, which I posted in
Hmm.
chat, and I'm showing to people on screen. And indeed, the cross-sectional hypothesis appears to be proven. And so, one of basically what
Well,
they
I mean,
do,
in science, you don't really prove anything,
sure,
unless you're speaking about. So it corroborates, to put it in better terminology,
sure.
it corroborates the theory.
Sure. So, to explain a little bit of why I actually reject this evidence,
Hmm.
the actual procedure for what they do is not looking at unit prices. They're not looking at, say, like the individual price of a shoe and the labor that went into a shoe. They are using those input output tables that you mentioned. And so, for that, they'll look at the entire industry. And so it'll be like, I don't know, I think usually it'll be like agriculture as an industry. It'll be like clothing as an industry. And so theoretically, you can argue this is like a valid or invalid point. However, one of the problems with this is that because you're looking at total industries, there is before I get into that, I do just want to agree that I do agree that what you observe is observed, and the author that I'm going to cite agrees that it is observed. The assertion is that this observation is not, in fact, evidence for the labor theory value because it's a spurious correlation. The assertion is that fundamentally what you're doing by looking at a whole industry is you're taking, instead of looking at P, like price, and comparing it to V, value, and comparing the two, you're looking at Q times P, quantity times price, which is the total output of a given industry, and Q times V, the total output of a given firm.
You're actually not doing that. So when you're computing these variables, you're looking at it in unit terms, actually. So
I don't
so
believe this is
so
the
here
case.
So this depending on which person does this specific analysis. Cockshot, for example, in he has a video in YouTube where he looks at total output. But
Mm-hmm.
we are actually, so in the studies that I'm telling you, this is not how it's done. So we are looking at it in unit terms. Okay. So initially, when we're decomposing price into vertically integrated labor times and vertically integrated profits, what we are doing is first we're taking the equation, the basic accounting equation, that price sorry, that profits is revenue minus costs. We divide each one of these variables by total output. So we are already speaking in unit terms.
So one of the
And
problems
then we
is,
get the relationship that, sorry,
sorry. Well, no. So finish.
and then we get the relationship that of price that then we use algebraically to get to the equation of prices of production that then is used to make these measurements.
That would be valid. The critique is that in fact these authors don't do so.
So
Um,
I don't think so. Okay, if you're looking at the empirical evidence that Shaikh provides and that others provide in this tradition, we are not speaking about. So first of all, it's not even correlation analysis. So this is something that Anwar Shaikh even notes in his book,
mhm.
that for cross-sectional data, uh, so regression analysis is not really the best method of bringing about this empirical testing. That's why we use the mean absolute weighted deviation to measure dispersion, to measure the the
Sure,
difference.
but
So
to be clear,
the
the mean average weighted deviation is still just fundamentally a measure of correlation. It's a measure of how well the dispersion in one correlates with the dispersion of the other. And so the problem again is you're looking at the dispersion of Q times P or Q times V. Um, if you look, for example, if you, I sent in chat, for example, the source of the
so
Shike
you can do it.
PDF.
So
So like
okay.
if you click on the PDF Bellofior 1998.pdf and you go to page I think 223, which I have up on my screen, you can just see like what the data they're doing is. And so Shike is citing Ochoa 1984 using the input output years 47, 58, 63, 67, and 72. Um, and when you look at the actual like variables that they're using, they're looking at total labor times. They're looking at total integrated labor times, and they do not divide by the size of a given sector. In fact, the author that I'm citing, Kleeman, does so, and when they do so, the results are not very are basically not statistically significant anymore. So just to walk it through, to give my little spiel, um, step one of what Kleeman does is he produces the exact same table that like Shike and Cockshot and all the others produce, right? You can see here in this table that the price value deviations are very small. The MAWD is also around 8% in the data that they have, USA 1977 to 1977, 97. So great, looks good so far. Then the problem is you need some way to account for the fact that industries are bigger or smaller. So what does he do? Again, just posting it so you can read along. And I understand I can't really ask you to read through all of this and understand it in like 10 seconds or whatever. So we can take our time. At the top, he says, quote, I have chosen to deflate the sectoral aggregate prices and values by aggregate labor and non-labor costs, which he calls the vector C. So for the vector P and for the vector V, he produces now a deflated small p and small v, where you take P, you divide it by C, which is prices divided by total costs, basically. You take value divided by total cost, and you get a deflated value, deflated price. Then you again look at the results, and unfortunately, after you do so, there's no significant correlation. In this table, 3, on the far right, you can see the r squared. I'm sorry, like the far right of each, it's formatted a little odd, but like there's 4 columns. The 4th column and the 8th column are both the r squared values. So the far right of each, like half of the table or something, is the r squared value. And you can see that after you've done this adjustment, the r squared is near 0. In other words, where the r squared in the old study was like near 1, it was near unity, suggesting that labor was almost exactly identical to the value of price, and the value, like that value was 1-to-1 with price. Instead, in this one, you find virtually no predictive capacity. So this is Kleeman, and I'll just leave it here and we can discuss this for a little bit. There's a second study which I think extends this a little bit, but this is like the initial study I'll present.
Yeah, okay. If we're speaking about Kleeman,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know exactly how he does it there, but I can tell you that if you look at it in unit terms, it doesn't really change the picture. So this is actually, there's a paper actually responding to Kleeman on this
Mm-hmm.
by 2 authors,
Yep,
and they
Cockshot
actually
and
look at
Cottrell.
this. So actually, so there is even another one. I'll link it to you later.
Sure.
But the thing is, this thing that he speaks about spurious correlation again. Even if you look at it in unit terms, this relationship still holds. I don't know exactly how Kleeman does it, but I can tell you this far that Anwar Sheikh, for example, he looks at it in even in his book. He does this
Well, the
this
question
empirical
then is
experiment.
where is the data that they're getting those unit terms from? Like one of the things that Kleeman notes is that we basically just don't have this data. For better and worse, the U.S. does not produce data on like the unit prices of like Adidas shoes, and they
No,
don't require.
you
Sorry,
compute it from the input output data itself.
but then what are they using
By
to
looking
deflate
at
it by?
total revenue, so by looking, for example, at total revenue and dividing it by the quantity produced.
Oh, sure. So one of the things that Scheich note, not Scheich. So in one of their responses in this debate, so this is Kleeman 2002. In the next one, basically, as I recall, it's this one. Um, Kleeman demonstrates that if you no, I think it might be in the first part of this one. Basically, in one of these articles, Kleeman goes through and demonstrates that other measures of quantity, of like size of a given sector, are basically really bad. So the example they cite is that in tobacco, for example, a few small firms, it's like 6 big firms in the United States, do almost all of the production. So number of firms is basically a worthless deflator. But then in like services, there's a million firms, there's a million mom and pop shops. But services, right? Like services that are provided are enormously larger than is tobacco, obviously. So this is just like this is not a helpful deflator, I guess, is the critique that he's raising. And there might be another deflator that's being used, but that's the critique of the one that I believe that he was critiqued for. And I
Yeah,
understand.
again,
Sorry.
yeah, again. So as far as I can tell you, like even if you
Mm-hmm.
look at it in unit terms, this relationship still holds. So, and even if we speak about the other hypotheses, you can still look at them. Um, the time series hypothesis, and they still work even in unit terms. So I mean, I don't really know exactly how Kleiman does it, but I can tell you this much that it is done in unit terms and that it's actually still holds this relationship.
Sure. So perhaps
And even
in
if we measure it in aggregate, it doesn't really give you. This is not really that much of a
it
of a
it
critique.
actually very much is. So that's the second study we can get to a little bit. It's Nitzen and Bitchler. I don't. I think I want to call them Bichler, but Nitzlin and Bitchler. This one is really nice because it's actually interactive. So if you click on the link which reads like Cockshot Nitzen Bitchler testing the LTV spurious correlation .xls, you can literally download the file and do it yourself. And so if you pull up the file, which I have on Google Sheets, for example, they present an example where the labor theory value has no predictive power. The way they do this is I might actually share screens here so I can show you as well. There we go.
Okay.
Here, one moment. So, that didn't quite work. So, what you can do here, brief explanation. First, you've got 20 sectors in an economy. That's just a random number. You can pick any number you want. This analysis will still
Mhm.
hold. Then they set it such that the sectors vary in quantity, right? So that's the Q I was talking about before. And so the way they do it is each sector is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. You can change it to use any number you please. The results still hold. You can do it yourself. I did it myself. Um, so what you see is you've got some sectors that are very small and some sectors that are very large, right? Sector 1 produces 1 unit, sector 20 produces 2,000 units. Then they present an example where price and value are literally uncorrelated. There is no correlation between them. And the way they do this is that they just take a random number from Excel. And so it's a number between, like, I want to say it's 0 and 10, just randomly chosen. And so necessarily, two random numbers are not correlated with each other. So in this definition, the labor theory value has 0 predictive capacity. And yet, if you do the analysis that Cockshot and Scheich do of Q times P against Q times V, you will find in this third graph that there is a very good linear relationship between the two, despite the fact that, as you can see in graph number 1, there is no correlation between unit price and unit value. So in short, there does seem to be pretty strong evidence that this methodology can lead to a spurious correlation, because in this example, it is spurious and it does lead to the conclusion that they arrived at. So
Okay,
that's
this is what I was saying. This is this is if you're doing it in these terms, and depending on the type of analysis that you do, by the way, because this is something that Shaikh notes in his book when he's speaking precisely about this particular issue, right? So he puts it in these terms. Okay, why can you not use regression analysis? or why it leads to problems in identify so in interpretation of this issue when you're doing regression analysis with input output data.
Mm-hmm.
And the example that he puts, he does a numerical example, like the numerical example that you're doing, and he notes pretty much the exact same thing. So he says, if we change the units, so if we have a table, okay, with this,
Mm-hmm.
if we change the units so that now all labor times are equal, so if you change the scale so that now all labor times are equal,
Mm-hmm.
then you will have the following problem of interpretation. So in the first part, in the original model, when there is no in the original data where there's no transformation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you see that there is a strong R squared, so there is a good correlation using
Mm-hmm.
that numerical example, and that when you add output adds a little bit of explanatory power. So if the R squared was 0.93, now it's 0.96. Okay, and then he notes, but if you do this change in scale, so if you do this change in units,
Mm-hmm.
and then have all of the labor times are equal, and you do a regression analysis, you find that the R square is 0. And if you add output now, then the R square becomes 0.96. So he says, look, the problem is that now if you do this, it seems as if output includes all of the all of the explanatory power, whereas
Mm-hmm.
before output only included a little bit of the explanatory power. But if you look at it in unit terms and you don't do the multiplication by output, you still get that relationship. So I
It,
think
so this could be true. I think I want to swear that you're referring to. I know that I watched through like Shrike's lecture series, and I think that you're referring to there is the increase of explanatory power of looking at like integrated labor plus integrated outputs versus just integrated labor. And I do agree that in that example that was like a small increase of explanation, but
so
I'm
I don't
pretty
know. I don't know
sure.
if
Sorry.
I don't know if he uses this exact example in his lecture. I don't know if he uses it. But what I can tell you is that if you look at the book at the chapter where he discusses the classical theory of relative prices,
Mm-hmm.
and when he starts, so he has a section where he does a change in units, and then a
But what
subsection
is the
within that.
change in the units? I guess is what I should ask. Like the
Okay. So
change of the
imagine
unit
you're measuring.
prices, or.
No, no, no. So imagine you are measuring uh, uh, imagine you're measuring the output in kilograms,
Mm-hmm.
and he changed it to bales, okay, and he says that 2.56 bales equals a kilogram or something like this, and then you include this into the model. So this transformation. So now because of the numerical example that he did, now all of the labor times are going to be equal.
I,
All of
I
the labor values.
are you? So I feel like I'm just like maybe I'm not getting the substance of the critique. Are you referring here now to the critique which was raised that hey, instead of looking at labor, we should look at other inputs like chemicals and see that those have little to
No.
no correlation?
No, I'm not looking at. I'm not talking about
Hmm.
that. I'm talking about if you. So it's something that happens a lot in regression analysis. So in any kind of analysis where you change units, you employ some kind of transformation
Mm-hmm.
into the variables,
Mm-hmm.
and then you see what happens within that transformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a linear transformation using OLS, for example, you can prove that there's not going to be a change in the R squared. But depending on the type of model that you do, depending on the type of regression that you do, you will get different results, right? So what he does here is he does the model where there's no transformation, where there's no change in units, okay, and he does it with in unit terms, and then he multiplies each of the prices and labor values by quantity, and
Mm-hmm.
he sees, this is what I was telling you, that there is an increase in the R squared that is brought about by bringing up the quantity. And then he says this is adding up a little bit of explanatory power. But if we change units so that now all labor times are equal,
Mm-hmm.
and you do the R squared for the model where there is no multiplication of prices and labor times the quantity, then you get an R squared of 0.
Wake up,
But if you
neighbor.
bring about
Love you.
the model where there is this multiplication, then you get a 0.96, something like that, R squared, which means that output has brought about all of the explanatory power. But he says this is the problem of using regression analysis. This is why he doesn't use regression analysis.
So I need to read through. I found the section in Psych, and I'll read through it after the discussion. I'm pretty sure, however, this is not a valid critique. So one of the things that Kleeman does, and I can show you the bit in Kleeman where he does so, is to show that the specific type of the model that they use is not relevant to this general finding that you can divide output by quantity. So let me find exactly that quote. Yeah. So for example, what Kleeman does is they assume that the labor theory value is true using the equation that they derive from other people. They created a simulated set of values using that, and then they use their transformation, and they still found that all of the results held if the labor theory of value held. So I don't think that it's entirely valid just to assert that the transformation is the cause of the failure in this. Because again, using simulated
The problem is
models.
regression analysis. That's the problem. That's why you need to use the measure of distance between vectors.
Sure, but I mean, like, they demonstrate the same. Like, if you basically the distance between vectors will also be spuriously reduced by quantity, because you've like spuriously correlated them through like multiplying them by quantity, and so you need to eliminate quantity to actually measure like the deviation. I think if you look in the first table, not the first. No, he doesn't have it in that one. I know that in another table, Kleeman does demonstrate that MAWD is also vulnerable to this problem of spurious correlation due to quantity.
Okay, I would need to look at how exactly Kleeman does it to be
Sure.
able to see whether or not. But what I can tell you a priori is that if the problem is that the studies are done on aggregate terms,
Mm-hmm.
that this is not really a problem because you can look at the same relationship in unit terms. In fact,
But
when you're building the model,
so I don't
you
want to
are
put you on the
assuming
spot, but like, what data are they using to do it in unit terms?
they're using so they're using input output data.
Mm-hmm. But that's
Okay.
all aggregate terms.
Yes, well that's why you divide it by total output
But we
to
just
put it
like
in unit
that's what
terms.
Kleeman does,
Okay,
right?
so imagine so again, imagine we have this relationship, okay? Profits equals revenue minus costs.
Mm-hmm.
And you divide each one of the variables times total output. What do you get?
Like profit
Unit
per.
profit, unit profits equals unit price minus unit cost.
So I think that actually, so this is one of the big things I want to say the 2005 paper of Kleeman showed is that the very fact of aggregation will reduce dispersion. No, it must be, maybe it's the
So this is
2004 one.
something that Shaikh also notes. I mean, it's not aggregation, it's vertical integration reduces dispersion because when you're uh, employing the process of vertical integration, you're bringing about, for example, for the profit wage ratios, you're bringing about a weighted average that is going to bring each individual one towards the mean. So it brings about what he calls damping effect,
Sure,
right?
but so the problem
But
with
that is
this
not
is
that is not like
that
flawed methodology.
no. So I think that the difference here is Kleeman and like the non-Marxians have no problem with the fact that you're looking at integrated stuff. I agree that integration will cause a reduction of dispersion just by its very nature, but a
Mhm.
non-labor theory value person can totally agree with that for a very simple reason. It's that further down the chain, right, like at raw materials, the cost of raw materials will be passed up to the next producer and up to the next producer and up to the next producer. Necessarily, the cost of like materials down the chain is highly correlated with the cost of materials up the chain. So just showing that like there's a strong correlation after you've done this isn't meaningful. What you need to do is look at the unit costs relative to the labor inputs.
But again,
So,
we're not looking I mean, we're not doing regression analysis. I don't
well,
know. I don't know how I can tell you this
well, sure, no, no,
in a
no. So this is why
You're looking
I keep referring to.
at their distance. When you're plotting these different points, data points, okay, you're plotting in them in a scatter plot, and you're drawing a 45-degree line, not a regression line, and
Mhm.
you see how close they are to each other in the 45-degree line. You're not using regression in the sense of R squared or anything of the sort.
Well, sure. So you're trying to find how close they are to each other. One of the
Yeah.
problems again with this is that the closeness. Here, let me just walk through the example. So, Kleeman 2004, right? What they do is they show an example of let's say an economy. And in this economy, let's say that there are three types of firms, something along those lines. In this economy, the labor theory value does not hold, or at least not relatively for relative prices. So industry one, did I send this picture? Yeah. Industry one, A1, produces with value 9 and price 9. Industry B1 produces with value 10 and price 12. And industry C1 produces at value 11 and price 9, which is, of course, if we're going to assume the labor theory value, this would be incorrect because the value is higher than the price, first off, and second off, there's no correlation between value and price. For A1, they're equal. For B1, the value is below the price is above the value, and for C1, the price is below the value. So there is no correlation between the two in this economy. But, so in short, if you actually looked at individual firms and at individual unit costs, you would find no labor theory value. But when you aggregate, which is what you do if you create a whole bunch of copies, like A2 to A10, B2 to B10, and C2 to C10, is that there does then become a correlation between value and price, which is what he shows in Table 3. When you do this aggregation of individual firms where this does not hold, you run into the same problem that Nitzan and Bichler are pointing out, that the very process of aggregation is bringing the distribution of the prices closer and closer together.
Yeah. So again, this is something that I don't think really applies to the studies that I'm referring to, mainly for the reason that I
Well,
was
but they're
speaking
using
about.
aggregated data, so it
So the model
necessarily
itself
refers.
the model itself is built on these terms of unit terms. So
Well,
this is
but it's not. It's
when
using
you
aggregate terms, right? When we're
no,
talking
so
about, sorry, go ahead.
okay, so one thing that it does is it aggregates within an industry, but between industries there's no aggregation in the sense that you're looking at the unit price, right? You're looking at the total revenue divided by output.
Yes, but you're looking at it for the entire industry. You're not looking at it for one firm. So
Yeah, exactly, because that's what input output table does. There's something that input output data itself doesn't allow you to do.
well, yes, and that's precisely the problem. It's that because it's so aggregated, you obtain these spurious correlations. That's basically the problem. It's that in the process of aggregation, even if you control for output, you divide by output size, the aggregation problem necessarily reduces the divergence of prices from each other. Like the way I think about this is, let's say that wanted to figure out the price of a hamburger and you wanted to correlate it to the price of beef. Well, if you just look at McDonald's versus one farm, there could be a relatively large divergence. But if you look at a whole bunch of firms, you average them together, it will pull them towards the mean. And if you look at a whole bunch of beef firms and average them, it will pull them towards the mean. So necessarily, the divergence between the two will be reduced if you look at two averages instead of a whole bunch of individual points. So the basic problem is that you need really, really disaggregated data, which we just don't have. So this evidence, I just don't think actually holds.
Something that is built in Marx's own examples, where he uses aggregate terms. He looks at three different industries, at three different industries, one for producers' goods, one for consumers' goods, and so on. And he does it in this very similar fashion of everything within an industry is in a sense aggregated. But again, so I think again, so your problem is basically aggregation within industries, right?
It's one, you need to control for the size of the industry, and two, even if you didn't, aggregation within industries
And that's
would
what
reduce
weight,
divergence.
that's why weights are employed to control for this type
So
of effect.
the problem is that weighting won't help you here. So like the reason I referred to the beef example is um, like you understand that necessarily the divergence between 2 points, which you have averaged together, is going to be smaller than the divergence of a whole bunch of points compared with a whole other bunch of
Yeah,
points.
yeah.
So the problem is that you can't just like weight one industry more than another. This is a problem for every single industry. Every single industry is going to have divergence that is too small. So it's going to be spurious.
Well, I mean, I really don't think this is going to be the case, and
Sure.
as far as I know, in terms of the empirical studies that have been done on this question using input output data, I think that it's fairly sound data that is used in these input output tables, and it's used for plenty other types of studies. So I mean, I really don't think that this is a problem. I would need to look exactly at,
Sure.
at the point made with Kleiman and how he exactly does this demonstration. But I can tell you this much: if you look at it in unit terms, using this disaggregated output, um, the relationships hold. The relationships that we predict still hold. And even as we're looking at the theory, at what the theory says, we are looking at it in this aggregated terms.
Hmm.
That's part of what abstract socially necessary labor time means.
So I guess I feel like it seems like at this point we both need to read each other's sources. I need to read a little bit of Scheich to see what he means with the unit conversion because I didn't fully get it on first reading. Um, And I guess I would actually really encourage you. I think Kleeman 2002 is a very simple, clean article. It's very easy to read through. He's got, like I said, the 2004 and 2005 ones if you want to read more into it. And the Nitzlan and Bischler article is also very clean and easy to read. And again, the point is it's an interactive example. If you go to the Google document, which I linked, you can literally press, if you're in like the document, if you click on one of the cells, you can press Control R over and over and over and over again, and you will get random values in an economy which labor theory value doesn't hold, and yet the results that Scheich and Cockshott points to do hold. And so I think that, to me, like the belief that this is not a spurious result just doesn't. You need like genuine unit level, highly disaggregated data, and we don't have it. So even were this to be true, we couldn't prove it at the moment. So maybe then I guess my suggestion was, since at this point we're maybe at a bit of an impasse, it might be good to move on to like another point.
Yeah,
Since
sure.
sure.
Let me just finish to say that
Mm-hmm.
uh, I agree with your point that it would be better if we had data at a more individual level, but at the level of abstraction at which this argument was developed and continues to be developed, we're speaking in these aggregate terms as industries as aggregations of individual firms. This is part of the reason for this is because in the theory of real competition,
Mm-hmm.
prices within industries are going to tend to be equalized within industries. So this is part of also of the theory, right?
Sure, but
Where
like
prices are going to
profit
be
profit
different.
equalization is not just a Marxian theory either, right? Like
Profit rates are going to be different, but prices are going to tend to be equalized within an industry. So there's going to be a dispersion of prices,
sure,
and this
but
is empirically found. So there is the dispersion of prices, even for single commodities, but there is a mode. So there
well,
is a very strong
so
outlier.
so one of the problems with this is when we're trying to compare, like say like the modern mainstream theory here is called the general economic equilibrium. It's basically a combination of marginalist supply and marginalist demand.
Mhm.
Um, Not from like an Austrian perspective, but just like marginal utility perspectives on both. And what you need to do is find examples where that theory would predict something at odds with like Marxian theory. And the problem is that both of these theories would predict something similar. That in general, competition is going to drive firms to have like reasonably similar prices, assuming they have reasonably similar production processes. And again, competition should encourage firms to have reasonably similar production processes because they should be moving towards more and more efficiency. That's something Marx
So
himself notes. So
I completely agree with you that there are different schools that have said similar things. But the fact that the conclusion is somewhat similar doesn't mean that the process to get to that conclusion is the same,
sure, no,
right?
no, but it's about testing. So like the point is like to make this a scientific theory, it needs to make like testable, predictable conclusions. And the problem is that if two theories predict the exact same thing and we observe that thing, we don't actually know which one's right. Like the analogy
We
would be that
know
sometimes
which
astrology. Sorry,
which we can know which one is better, right? So
not from this result. From other results, yes, but not from this result.
yeah,
No.
even from that result, we can look at the process that they chose to get there. So, for example, if we look at evolution and we see that the outcome is certain specific population dynamic patterns, okay, and then you have the creationists saying, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is clearly the product of God underlying doing some kind of tricks there, and then you have the people that defend the theory of evolution. They point to
Mm-hmm.
natural processes that bring this about. Okay, so you have two different theories that initially would claim that the observable pattern is very consistent with their theoretical blocks. But even from that simple result, we can see that one is better than the other because one is pointing at natural processes, whereas the other one isn't. Like
Um,
that's
So two things. One, I just want to say that chat is very taken with your aesthetic. They think you look pretty cute and professional. And two, I agree that you. Let me put it to you like this. We can think about scientific theories as like the simple way of thinking about it is there's like the empirics and there's the theory. And so the suggestion that I'm raising is for when you can't test, when there aren't different testable predictions, the empiric results are what's called ambivalent. They're equally like pointing towards one theory and the other. They offer equal strength to one and the other. So for the intelligent design example, it would be like, yes, the empirics offer equal strength in this particular example to intelligent design and evolution. The difference then is on the theoretical side. It's which the common solution is something like Occam's razor. Which system is simpler? Which system assumes less thing, or which system makes like in general we would say like less unreasonable or less unsound assumptions. And so I do agree that like then we can talk about things from a theoretical level, and I'd certainly be willing to do so because it seems like the empirical evidence here is in dispute. So on that note, the the basic critique of like the labor theory value from a theoretical level is how one decides that it's basically how does one decide how much particles a given hour of labor like imbues in terms of labor time to like that object. Now I know that's like hyper simplified, but the basic question is how do I know, for example, that my labor imbues like 1 hour, but someone else's labor imbues 2 hours? Because in general, Marxists presumably have to have a way to acknowledge the fact that skilled labor can imbue more labor hours than unskilled labor. Similarly, there needs to be some way to account for the fact that some machines can be more productive than other machines. I think in your own videos, you mentioned the differentiation between productive and unproductive labor. In short, how do we determine when the particles of labor value are flowing and when they're not?
So all of those points that you are raising are really good points, and I
Mm-hmm.
completely agree with you that a theory needs to know how to differentiate these different things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we start, for example, different skills, so there's actually a growing body of empiric, so of study that is trying to be done on this question.
Mm-hmm.
And the initial thing that I would say is, okay, so some people are able to produce more in less time than other people. Okay, imagine we are both, you and I, are
Mm-hmm.
producers of uh, corn.
Wake up,
Okay,
Cleveland.
say we are
I
producers of
love
corn,
you.
Sure.
and I am able to produce in 1 hour twice of what you are able to produce in 1 hour.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so perfect. The labor theory of value is perfectly capable of encompassing this. This would mean that in half the time, I'm able to produce the same that you produce,
Mm-hmm.
which means that my unit cost of in terms of labor has been reduced
Mm-hmm.
by half, which means, okay, that now I am going to be the more productive of the two, and I'm going to be able to sell at a lower price than you because now my costs are lower. So if you and I compete in the market,
Mm-hmm.
who is going to tend to prevail?
Sure. So in the long run, like the person with the most efficient labor time is going to win out. But then the question becomes, so there's like the problem is there's two related questions. One is how do you determine how much labor time comes in, um, and two is how do you determine that without using market values? Sorry.
That in that case, we know how much labor time. So
But
to
the
produce,
problem is that then you're using market values to assert that those market values are in fact the labor values. There's basically this problem of sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to stop you there, but so I think that it's just to clarify what your point might be. So you're trying to sell, so you're trying to bring effective demand into the equation, right? How do you know that that your labor is creating value?
Kind of,
And the
yes.
way
And how
now,
much value, but yes, not just
okay,
binary.
and the way in which we know is this concept of socially necessary labor time, right? So if you produce something for which there is no demand in the market, your
Mhm.
labor doesn't produce any value.
Well,
Okay.
sure. So one of the things that I think is interesting is the labor theory value, as conventionally proposed, has productive and unproductive labor. But you must recognize that in reality, it's not a binary; it's a gradient. There's like labor that is increasingly productive, and in general, that's why we talked about like increasing labor productivity. Like there's a
So
difference between you growing corn for like 1/10 of every hour, and then playing video games for the other 9/10, and then each tenth of an hour you add, you're doing more and more labor on the corn. Um, just like is that
Wake
a
up,
basic agreement
Cleveland.
or?
I love you.
so I mean, I think here in this regard, what I would say is that productive and unproductive labor refers to different categories as far as the labor that is necessary for as an activity for social reproduction is concerned. So, for example, there are three main different types of labor.
Mhm.
Well, four different kinds of activity. So two different types of labor, productive and unproductive, and three
Mhm.
different broad types of labor, right? Which is the labor that is done for production, the labor that is done in distribution, and the labor that is done in social reproduction. right?
Sure. But I'm just trying to apply this. I understand that that's usually given to sectors. It's that certain sectors are productive and certain sectors are unproductive. That's the way Adam Smith talked about it.
Mhm.
I guess I'm trying to apply this at like the individual level. It's how do you decide whether a given individual's labor is productive or
Okay,
not?
okay, perfect. Depending on the kinds of relations that are that exist at the moment in which this person is engaging in labor. So this is a
Well,
really good example. I think you can get it in this example. So imagine that you are a fisherman, okay? And this is the
mm-hmm,
example that I give. So you produce fish. You
Wake up,
catch the
neighbor.
fish, okay? And
Hello?
imagine
mm-hmm,
it takes 1 hour to catch 1 kilogram uh of salmon,
mm-hmm,
okay? Imagine this is the case, and then you go to the store, and now you have 1 hour to 1 kilogram of salmon. So the productive labor, and then you have also to cut the salmon to get it in the right shape, so that your
mm-hmm.
consumer will get it right in the proper shape. So in all of this time, you have been engaging in productive labor. But now imagine that you also have to take the salmon and distribute it to the consumer and get in exchange the money of the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
That is a form of labor which is distributive labor,
Mm-hmm.
which is a cashier, for example, right? Imagine you're also you're both the producer of salmon and the cashier in the store where you sell the salmon. Okay.
Sure.
So you are engaged in productive labor when you're producing the salmon, and in non-productive labor when you are being the cashier.
Well, sure.
When
So I understand that's coming at it again from like the sectoral perspective. That it's the assertion that in Marx that like transportation is productive but distribution isn't, sort of things. Um,
there is transportation that is distributive as well.
sure. And so I guess one of the things that's like interesting to me is how do you know? Like the basic question is how do you know that like the cashier is not productive but the like fishing is, the preparation of the fish is?
Perfect. Good question. So that's because the we define production as the creation or transformation of use values, of objects of social use. Are you producing when you transfer an existing use value to the consumer? Are you producing any wealth beyond
You,
the wealth that already existed? The fish
well,
is already there. You already have the fish.
the,
You're just distributing it
Well,
to the
that's
consumer.
precisely one of the interesting innovations of like modern economics is that commodities. How do I put this? In Marx, commodities are often delocationalized, as it were. Like the fish kind of just exists, but its location isn't part of that commodity. And yet, in modern economics, we would actually say that a commodity is like a combination of the physical product, like where it is, what time it is, and so on. And so it has this space-time like attribute as well. And so modern economics would say actually it is productive because you are adding use value to it. You're changing the locational property of the object by moving it to someone else. You are increasing the use value.
So that's actually that's actually a good point. But this is something that I have a comeback for, which is it is changing the property. So transportation, and this is something that Marx already knows, changes the property of the location. So the example that I put is if I produce wine in the in the mountains in Spain, okay, and then I
Mm-hmm.
have to sell it in the city, the wine in the mountains doesn't produce so it's not useful. It's not an object of social use for the consumers in the city, in Madrid, for example. So there is a property that is making that object not an object of social use in its current location, which is its location, and transportation enhances that property of its location, so transforms that property so that it now has use value, so that it's now useful for the society at large. So what I mean here is, okay, when you transfer something, when you are engaging in distributive labor, such as when you handing, you are changing
Mm-hmm.
one property of the commodity, which is its ownership. And in
But
doing
that's kind
this,
of the
you're
thing
only
though, because there's never like there's only one instant. Like let's say it's the Planck second where you're physically like handing the fish over to Bob or something that you're transferring ownership. All the rest of it is changing those properties. Every Planck second up until that very moment, something is actually being meaningfully changed about it. And actually, let's just stay on that for a moment.
Yeah, so let me explain. So
Mm-hmm.
you're changing the property, but only insofar as that object is considered as an object of ownership. But insofar as it's considered as an object of social use, you're not changing that particular property. So
Well,
for
but
example,
that's
imagine
kind of the
I'm a
point
king.
though, because you are. Well,
So
so to
imagine
to move to the other example that I was going to point out, like the I think that this binary distinction is actually very unhelpful. The analogy with the fish, let's extend it. Let's imagine that there are two types of fish. One is like poisonous and one is not. And so the poisonous fish is poisonous to everyone in the local village. Right now, it has a zero use value to everyone in the village, or maybe even negative use value.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then,
if they want to buy it, no.
sorry?
If they still want to buy it because they don't know that it's poisonous,
Well, so like I was just going to present an example where
yeah, sure.
you've got a village. They're producing poisonous fish, and then some like let's say some like Europeans come in and they aren't so there's some colonialists and they come in and they aren't poisoned by the fish, and they come into the town, and now for a subset of consumers that product has a positive use value, and so now people do produce it. Now it is a commodity, and now it is traded. It seems to me like the fact that different products provided to different people, that the transference of where people are can change the use value, very strongly indicates that location should be part of
And
like
it is.
use value.
And it actually is. That's why
But
transportation is also to be considered, depending on the type of transportation, but transportation is also considered as production labor.
well, sure, but then it seems like there's no distinction between distribution and transportation until like the very final plank second or something. These are really
So,
just the same thing.
so there's actually okay, so distribution. So I think you're conflating here distribution and transportation. So when I speak of distribution, I'm speaking of changing the ownership over things. Okay, so imagine we abstract for a second, because
Mm-hmm.
all society need to engage in these three different types of labor. Imagine we are in a feudal society and I'm the king. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I have a set of peasants that are producing corn and wheat and many other things. And my labor is to take all of those things and distribute them according to whatever my desires are, or
Mm-hmm.
according to whatever plan I have. The production of the wheat, of everything basically
Mm-hmm.
that has been produced, is the production labor. But when I am distributing it, it's already there. It's already produced. It's already wealth. They are already objects of social use. But now I'm changing the ownership of the over that thing. I'm saying, okay, this belonged to me, now it belongs to you. So the distribution doesn't really create new wealth, it just distributes the existing wealth.
Well,
But
so
transportation
sorry.
does create new wealth, because
So
if that is in a place where it cannot be used, then it is not wealth. If it's in Mars, it cannot be used, it's not wealth.
I think to try and summarize a bit of the difficulty we're having in this conversation, I think one of the big problems with the labor theory of value is that it is fundamentally a supply side theory of value. It asserts that like the labor that goes into a product, the use value that goes into a product, is the fundamental determinant of like that product's ultimate like total value, capital V value or whatever. And the problem with this is like again part of the reason that modern economics has the general equilibrium model is it includes both supply side and demand side differences. And so like one of the things that I think is really interesting is human biases as it relates to like ownership and so on. There's this very well known in like behavioral economics set of studies which demonstrate that people value things they own much more than things that they don't own. So if the example is like, how much would you pay to get a mug? People will say $5. They give someone a mug. They say, how many dollars would you pay to sell this mug? It's $10. So people are totally irrational when it comes to the concept of ownership. People literally do think that owning stuff creates value. And so I think that the labor theory of value and the classical way of coming at this, which is entirely supply side, it asserts that use value is in the product, is just not an accurate representation of how humans, who are highly flawed, actually think about products, because they do think about it as though ownership, as though distribution does create value. So it's a better predictor of how humans actually operate.
So I like your point, and this is a crucial thing that I think is a misunderstanding on the part of a lot of utility theorists of Marx, which is that because Marx says at the beginning of Das Kapital that we should abstract from use value, that then they say, okay, this means that use value no longer is an important thing, and Marx no longer cares about use value at all. And this is wrong. Okay, this is only if you read. This is a poor interpretation of the beginning of Das Kapital, but this is not what Marx really is saying. He's saying that at that analytical stage, we
Mm-hmm.
should abstract, because he's speaking about abstract terms, right? But then he also includes effective demand in later stages. And if he had been able to write more of what he wanted to write, he probably would have included even more caveats. But just to respond to what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
utility, okay, usefulness is a necessary condition for a commodity to be a commodity. This
Sure,
is something that you and
but
I agree on, right? Objects must be useful. socially useful before they are exchanged. Because even something that you personally might say this is incredibly stupid, right? Like for example, my grandfather, he might see it like a toy and he might say this is stupid. Who would want to buy it? But there are
Hmm.
people that want to buy it, so it's socially useful. Okay. Now, if my grandfather was correct, and that was a worthless piece of plastic that nobody wanted to buy,
Hmm.
then that thing wouldn't constitute value. So if you produce that thing, your labor is not creating any value. And then imagine you have produced 10 of those, and 10 of those find a market because you find 10 people that want to purchase it. But now imagine that you have 10 people that want to purchase it and you've produced 20. Then you have employed more labor than the socially necessary,
So
because
one of
labor in socially necessary also refers to the amount that is going to be condoned by effective demand.
So one of the things that I find, like I brought this up before, that I find frustrating in the Marxian theory is that it has this binary sense of use value. It's that people want it, it has use value, and people are going to exchange it. Now it's a commodity, but that this kind of binary thing. When a much better predictor is to think about these things on gradients, to think about them as marginal effects. So the analogy is that let's say a donut. Let's say that literally everyone in society likes donuts, so it has a use value, 100%. But the point of bringing in marginalism to this is that there's a marginal benefit to a donut. Your first donut, you love it. It's like 10 smiles or whatever, right? You give the first donut 10 smiles. But 10 donuts, that's a little bit less useful. 100 donuts, it's a lot less useful. 1,000 donuts, it's a lot less useful. So there's a point at which this idea of use value needs to be not just a binary, but needs to incorporate the preferences of people. Because otherwise, it doesn't allow for the fact that after a certain point, people value things extremely lowly. In short, the basic point here is that use value to the consumer is dependent on what they already have.
Okay, so this is a point that is by no means something that is ignored in the classical tradition or in Marx. Now, what is ignored is more of these utility functions and the marginal effects in utility functions, right? Where you use calculus to find the maximum point. Okay, so all of this is clearly abstracted from, but you don't need utility functions to understand that if someone is really thirsty, and this is something that Adam Smith himself already understood, that if someone is
You
really, really
don't need
thirsty,
it, but it
they are
helps better
planning
explain it.
to,
Like the
they are
point is that. Sorry, go ahead.
so so it's something that is known from the very time of Adam Smith and certainly of Marx, that if you're extremely thirsty, you are going to be willing to pay for a glass of water much more than you would if you had already drunk a kilogram of sorry a liter of water. This is
Well,
something that is well
so
incorporated into the
the
theory.
problem is that intuition is useful, but it's like a little bit useful. When you have the ability to expand this to a whole mathematical theory, which can make predictions, then it is much more useful. Like actually, I was thinking of this paper from Uber, not like literally made by Uber, but like it used Uber data. Let me see if I can find it real quick. In short, it showed that like people's demand for Uber changes with the price of Uber, which is exactly what you'd expect. But it doesn't change in this like binary way where there's like this point at which they won't consume Uber. It's that fewer and fewer people will consume Uber. It's that there's like some marginal point for each individual person for how much they value Uber. Or put another way, like use value is highly dependent on the consumer. Again, like the whole point here is that.
So
But
I completely agree with you on this point. Now, of course, we cannot measure utility. We cannot really make interpersonal comparisons of utility and all of this, but utility is still something there. People have subjective experiences about things in the world. But the point of the labor theory of value is that in the chaotic world that market economies are, there is some. So in the chaotic world, well, everyone has their own preferences. Everyone comes with a different set of values, or very similar, but different in the margin or whatever. So everyone comes there's heterogeneity, and there is a competitive struggle between producers, between different kinds of economic agents, right?
mhm.
And in this competitive struggle, there seems to emerge empirically some kind of order. There seems to be patterns that emerge from this kind of chaotic environment. So the point of the labor theory of value is that you can look at these patterns, you can understand these patterns without needing to appeal to individual preferences. So okay,
But the,
so
but
so this
then
is
then- but then but then the problem is like it doesn't. Then what are you appealing to? Like in short,
you're
if
appealing
you're
to aggregate behaviors.
well,
So this is
but
something
then that's
that
precisely what the mainstream theory is doing, right? What they do ultimately, like in micro, right? They'll look at individuals, but when you're actually looking at data, they're looking at huge aggregates of individuals
they
because
have
we can aggregate this behavior. And so it
so
seems to me like tacitly you're conceding to, like on the demand side anyway, that use value is determined by the individual consumer, right? Or not rather the individual consumer, the aggregate behavior of many individuals of consumers. Like in this Uber example, for example, you can just look at the graph. The demand changes as price changes. And it's not like there's this sudden point at which people don't want Uber anymore. It changes slowly as price goes up. Um, so it does seem like. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so what what I wanted to tell you is this: is the problem is not really with having a microeconomic foundation, because we clearly need some kind of microeconomic foundation to understand aggregate patterns. The problem is that we don't really need a very specific one or anything of the sort. The point that I was trying to get to is the following: is uh, aggregate patterns don't depend on individual motives. I see you're entertained with the cat, so I don't want to.
If they don't, then what do they depend on?
So they depend on the interaction. Okay, they depend on an environment and in the interaction and the logic of the system in which these different agents exist, right? So they depend on a given environment and on the logic of the interaction between different people. So,
But
for
then
example,
this
this
seems like it's basically just conceding to the argument that it's like marginal utility on the consumer side.
so this is something that is also applied to physics, for example, and Warshak notes this in his section on microeconomics. He notes the following thing. He says, "Look, um, I could explain perfectly well downward sloping demand curves with a wide variety of microeconomic foundations, okay, and other empirically well supported ideas, Engels curves, and so on and so forth, Engel curves, okay. So you can explain this with a variety of microeconomic foundations, which means that uh, you can posit a microeconomic foundation that is really bizarre, that is completely, like, it doesn't make really any sense, and still get right the aggregate pattern, which means that you don't really need an accurate microeconomic foundation to understand the aggregate patterns, because you can easily bring about a flawed microeconomic foundation and get a, a
Well,
macroeconomic pattern.
so I agree that pointing out that bad micro models can accurately predict things at the like macro level is a reasonable critique of some micro models. But that's why there's been so much work, particularly since the 70s, in trying to develop these individually accurate micro models. So, like when I cited, for example, the mug thing, that's a result of what's called the endowment effect. We can literally observe individuals treating things differently after they purchase it than before they purchase it. The whole point is to build this more accurate model rather than basically, I think that a lot of people will just appeal to the LTV and they'll say, hey, it's just use value. Sure, but just use value is just not very useful for actually predicting people's behavior. I do agree, I want a more accurate micro, and that's precisely why we can't just use these like old classical theories. We basically need to incorporate marginal utility from the consumer end in a variety of these like biased human ways.
So I clearly agree with you on the sense that it's never wrong and it's never scientifically unsound to incorporate more levels of concretion into the models. And this is something that I completely agree with you. And this is something that, for example, Anwar Sheikh is trying to do, and other economists in this tradition are trying to do. For example, there's a lecture series on microeconomic foundations and many books.
Mm-hmm.
So like this is all thing that is that people in this tradition are clearly working on, because it's obviously a thing that you need to do at some point or another. But the key idea is that you don't really need it to explain in a certain level of abstraction. Again, it's always getting more concrete. It's always bringing about better, more accurate, more effective models. So it's always about this. Okay, science is always about trying to incorporate more things and trying to explain a broader variety of phenomena and so on. But just saying marginal utility, blah blah blah,
Mm-hmm.
and putting it within another microeconomic foundation that is not really that accurate, is
Well,
really the kind of approach that I am not really favorable of.
so
So
I will.
I agree that
How,
marginalization occurs,
are you
but I
familiar? Are you
yeah,
familiar with the quote from Isaac Asimov of "Wronger than wrong"? If not, it's totally fine.
no, I mean,
Um, Sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, I was just saying that
Sorry.
that uh, the fact that you can point to marginalism and that marginalism is not has not been in a systematic uh, very profound manner being incorporated into Marxian analysis of certain economic phenomena or of most of the economic phenomena that it looks at, doesn't mean that you should get rid of the Marxian economic analysis. You should
Well,
try to incorporate it, certainly, but that doesn't mean that what is already been developed is wrong.
well, so
See what I mean?
so I asked you if you're familiar with the phrase "wronger than wrong," and if not, it's totally fine.
So I don't think I'm familiar with that. No.
It's like just something that Isaac Asimov, like a sci-fi writer, said. The basic idea is that yes. So the analogy is, let's say you've got three models. One model is that the Earth is like a flat disk. One model is that the Earth is a perfect sphere, and the other is that it's an oblate spheroid with a little bit of like pudginess around the edges, basically. So the sphere model of the Earth is wrong, but the flat Earth model is wronger than wrong because it is further from the truth than the spherical model. And so when I hear, like, hey, a lot of these micro models have really big problems, I totally agree. That's why there's been this enormous revolution recently of moving away from these, like, silly, kind of axiomatic, often Austrian inspired neoclassical models where people are all rational agents who never make any stupid decisions to these behavioral economic micro models. That's why we're doing all of this. But the contention here is that the comparison is when we just look at very simplistic models like use value in this almost binary sense of whether something is useful to society or it isn't. That is even wronger in some ways than the simple models. And so the suggestion is that we should use models that are better, even if they're flawed, over models that are even more flawed.
Okay, and I completely agree with you on that. But I think that we already have a pretty good model of relative prices, and incorporating more caveats into it. Uh, it's a thing that we should, but we shouldn't get rid of this model and then try to find a utility based model for relative prices, because I don't even know
Well, but
in
that's
any
when you say use value, that's literally what it means. Like utility is ability to be used. Like it's
the
not even
problem.
really disagreeing with Marx at this point. It's just like trying to show an actual way of determining what use value is and showing that use value isn't this big societal thing. It's an individual thing, which is aggregated out. It is aggregated up to society, but it's an individual thing.
Don't agree with. So human beings are thon political and they're social beings. Okay, so individual preferences, individual motives, individual psychological phenomena, and this in the literature, in the psychological literature on this is pretty
Mm-hmm.
well documented. Uh, they are highly shaped by our social environments, and we
Sure,
certainly have an inner biologically determined predispositions, but that doesn't mean that most of what constitute our preferences and so on are not socially determined. So I don't believe, for
sure.
example, in free will.
Well,
This is something that I don't believe in. So now we are moving more to philosophy than to economics. But I don't believe, for example, in free will. I think human beings are deterministic entities,
sure,
and I think that we can easily predict. Well, I mean, right now at the stage at which we are, not so easily, or certain things more or less. But I think we can predict certain patterns of individual behavior if we present individuals in a determined social environment, and so on and so forth. And social psychology, for example, is really interested in these questions of how society impacts these individual motives, or how do humans behave collectively with one another. And I think that looking at things in an atomistic sense, in a sense of looking at individual preferences, uh, stops you from looking at the inner the structural determinants of individual motives, which are social factors. And this is
so
part of materialistic analysis of society.
sure. So that's a broader point that like individuals are shaped by society. And this is one of those things again that like the modern theories of like preference are taking into account. I think that like basically Marx says that social preferences matter. The neoclassicals will agree that social preferences matter. The question is, how do you actually mathematically model it? Because the whole point is saying, like just saying that, hey, thirsty people want water, just saying that people's preferences are modeled by society, it's true,
But why
everyone
do
agrees
you
with it. The question is
believe?
actually like modeling it.
So do you believe in utility functions?
I think that most there's this model. What is it called? It's called cumulative prospect theory. Is like one of the big modern examples. It is not utility value per se, but it's like a modified utility value because it includes a lot of the biases that humans have. Like humans basically don't understand probability. We take losses a lot worse than we take gains. We value ownership more than we value loss. A whole bunch of these biases. It's just modified utility theory. But yes, at some fundamental value, humans do have some way of saying, I value this 1.1 times more than I value that. Yes.
Are you familiar with Duncan Foley?
No, at least not
He's also
offhand.
an he's also an economist that teaches at the New School for Social Research, and
Mm-hmm.
he actually has really good work on this issue of microeconomics and how to use Marxian and classical understanding. So if there's a really nice lecture on so series of lectures in YouTube from Duncan Foley on
Mm-hmm.
advanced microeconomics that he gave at the New School, and there you can see these models trying to look at microeconomic behavior using laws of entropy and so on and so forth. So a more econophysics approach,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see perfectly well that these models are trying to be incorporated also within a more classical Marxian story, and that they are perfectly valid within. That you
Well,
don't need to throw this out of the window, and you don't need to include general equilibrium theory in order to understand these patterns.
well, so I guess to try and wrap up this section, it seems like the argument you're raising is that most of the points that I'm trying to raise can be incorporated back into the classical model, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But what my suggestion is that is like basically on the demand side, that is just conceding to the idea that we should consider micro as like a combination of individual preferences, which are, of course, socially shaped. They are, of course, subject to all these biases, but it's like moving in that direction.
The sum of the parts, it's not the same as the behavior of the whole. That's the point of our
Sure,
theory of microeconomics and of macroeconomics.
sure, but I
And
think virtually everyone
going
agrees with that.
into physics, this is incredibly incorporated in physics and engineering and in many other sciences.
Yeah, like those are emergent properties. Like it's obviously that.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Properties.
But I'm just saying, like to me, it just sounds like fundamentally the classics are saying like, yeah, use value is a good idea, and yeah, the modern theory is a better way to say use value. Like if you want the way that I thought about this when I was doing my path from like a Marxian perspective to a non-Marxian perspective is, yeah, I still believe in labor theory of value, but on the demand side, I basically agree with the modern model. And so to me, this more or less sounds like the direction that they're currently taking it. They're trying to stick with the labor theory on the supply side, but on the demand side, they're increasingly moving to a modern conception of use value.
I mean, this is basically the thing that I would point at this point, which is um, you can understand relative prices already
Mm-hmm.
by looking at this structural component, which is determined by supply. Now, demand changes in demand create certain uh, uh, temporary distortions, but in a competitive environment, it is uh, production basically what is going to be the fundamental determinant of these market prices, relative market prices.
Sure.
So
Well,
this is basically the point that I was trying to get to. If you
well,
want to model also demand side and income distributions and so on and so forth, this is wonderful, and I think that this is something that needs to be incorporated, and that there's work being done to incorporate this, but that you shouldn't just like throw out of the window the prior development, because the prior development already brings us uh, uh, a long way into a good answer.
so this is, I guess, the third thing. So the theoretical thing on the demand side is one thing. Like I guess the critique of labor theory is that it mostly just focuses on supply. Sure, and we kind of talk that to death. So on the supply side, one of the critiques of Michael Romer, who is a Marxian and who is a market socialist, but who rejects the labor theory of value and rejects the falling theory of profit. One of the arguments that he raises, quite simply, is we know that labor has the ability to be exploited. Basically, it is a mathematical truth that like when the worker is paid less than the products of their labor, then exploitation occurs. However, one of the things that he notes is that this is true of literally every other factor of production. So I can link you a little bit of his essay from, not essay, his book called Free
But
to
all the
Lose.
factors of production don't create value. That's the
Well,
problem.
that's the question. How do you know that it's specifically labor which creates value? So the question is basically, in short, you can exploit corn. So the way that you consider it is for a worker. The way that you know that a worker is exploited is they produce 40 like units of value, but they only get paid for like 20 units of value. The same thing is true of most agricultural production. You get more out of the food than you put back into the food. To reproduce the food for the next year, akin to reproducing the worker for the next year, you don't put as much back in as you get out of it. And I can present, where is it? I think it's this one. Yeah,
But do you realize? Do you know this concept of depreciation?
sure. Yeah, things
So,
stuff
so
loses value.
the means of production transfer their own value into the commodity, but they don't add value beyond. That's what the laborers do.
So the question is, how do you know that? And it's not true for other things. Like, how do you know that it's not true that other things add value into the product?
Because they just transfer. They embody labor that they transfer. So okay, so imagine you're a capitalist and you have I don't know, you have a machine that produces um pieces of produces paper. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that machine embodies labor. So if you add laborers to that production process and you get a set of papers, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and you sell them in the market, and you and suddenly at some point after using that machine it's going to become useless, right? Because things get deteriorated throughout time, and that's how you measure depreciation is in the time that you have used it, how much have you been able to produce. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so the point is, um, laborers are able to work hours beyond the amount of hours that they need to work in order to reproduce, to obtain the means
Sure.
to reproduce. And they are the active ingredient in production as well, because they are the ones that produce the machinery. They're the ones that use the machinery. They are the ones that use up the different raw materials that are employed in production. Without workers, there's no production
So
unless you have some
the problem with that is that everything you said can be applied to other factors of production. Like in modern economic theories, we say labor is a factor of production, capital is a factor of production. And you can break down capital to individual things like corn. So
physical theories.
one of the things, like I think this paragraph very clearly explains it from Romer. He says, labor power is not the only productive factor that possesses the property of exploitability. I could take corn as the numeraire commodity, like the commodity by which everything else should be measured against, with respect to embodied values, right? Your suggestion is that labor puts value into capital, and then the capital gives out value from that labor. But what if we said that the thing that actually gave value to everything was corn? The reason labor has value is because we put corn into it in the first place. And as the labor slowly dies out, the corn is like giving out its value from it. The question, in short, is how can you define labor as something that is specifically unique in a way that nothing else is?
Well, first of all, because labor is used up in every single production process, and second of all, because there is no other raw material that is
Sure.
disponible in every.
So it's like some level of land, right? Let's say it's like we don't want to do a land theory value. Everything exists on some physical surface.
Okay, and then the next point is this: is because labor is the active ingredient in production. Is what takes
Oh, sure.
and second and then
Let's say
there's
now it's the energy theory of value, right?
And then there is a good question, by the way, at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
because one of the things that Marx noted is at the same time that when he realized that labor was what determined, in this fundamental sense, the relative prices, one of the things that he noted is that really the question now it's not that much if it does, but how does it do it and why is it labor? So that's a good thing, and I think that there can be different answers to this question. But fundamentally, I would say that labor is the active ingredient in production, and at
Well,
the same time it is one. So can we agree that if there is no labor, there is no production, and second of all, that the raw materials themselves and the machinery and all of that requires labor to be brought into the production process?
so if the argument is universality, the problem is that we can apply this to other things. Land is not the active ingredient, but we could say, hey, energy, it's involved in literally everything, and it's involved in the active production process. You can't do
Energy
anything if there's no energy.
labor. To
Well,
employ energy you require labor at the same time.
yes, but both of these things are universal. So just because one is involved doesn't mean the other isn't involved. How do you know which one is actually doing it?
I'm not saying that it's not involved. What I'm saying is that as far as value is concerned,
Mm-hmm.
it is labor. And this is also the case if you're speaking about it in definitional terms, because value is itself defined as abstract socially necessary labor time.
Well,
So
in the labor theory of value, yes, but you can't start with that conclusion and work backwards from it. The
okay, no,
conclusion
we're
that
starting from a
things have a
conclusion,
value. Sorry.
definition, from a conclusion. We're starting from a definition and we're saying, is this what regulates market prices? And
Well,
then we can get the conclusion if the empirical data supports.
sure, but then I guess the point is this is what rests on this first argument we were having. Is it empirically true that the amount of labor that goes into something is a great predictor of what comes out? And one of the things that we didn't touch on too much in the second bit of this discussion is in almost all the literature on discussing the labor theory of value, everyone seems to take it as true that price is a good proxy for value, which is probably not the case, and that price is a good proxy for labor. One of the problems with using price as a proxy for labor is that we can look at people's education levels.
What do you mean using price as a proxy for labor?
So people buy labor, right? Like if you're a capitalist, you go on the labor market and you buy labor, right? It sounds weird to say it, but that's what you do. Sure.
If you're what, sorry?
If you're
You cut off a little bit there.
sorry, if you're a capitalist, you go on the market and you buy labor. I know it sounds weird to say it, but that's what you do.
No, it's
So
true, and it's true. Labor
sure,
power is a commodity.
Sure, so labor power is a commodity. So one of the problems is that all of the studies, be it Scheich or Kleeman or whatever, the way they measure labor is not actual hours. They aren't measuring hours of labor at a given place. They're measuring wages. And so total labor wages is not one-to-one with number of hours put in. One of the things that's really interesting is that some labor, in terms of price, is priced much, much higher. The average salary of, I want to say the average yearly salary of a person with a PhD is around $75,000 in the United States. Someone with a master's is like 50. Someone with a BA is like 40. Someone without is like 30 in the United States, right? So you've got this very large difference in prices relating to the amount of like time that's went into some human being. And so maybe you can say that labor itself has embodied labor, that people have put labor into making that labor greater. But the problem is that those things don't seem to be linear. It seems very hard to argue that like a person with a PhD has precisely like 3 times as much labor put into him as does a person without a PhD.
One thing that you need to note here is the fact that wages, that the price of labor power is itself subject to a lot of struggle, so not competitive, but war-like struggle between the owners of capital and workers themselves. So this
Yeah.
is one of the things that relate. Okay, so this is one of the things that is incorporated pretty well in the labor theory of value, which is um, the rate of surplus value, which depends on surplus value and depends on necessary value, and the necessary value required to reproduce the laborers, so on variable capital, which constitutes the wages of productive laborers. Uh, this is subject to social dispute, and we know that different industries, that different conditions lead to different forms of laborers, different types of labor power, uh, uh, gaining some advantage, some losing some advantage. So imagine this is a very good example that, for example, is used in Spain a lot, which is
Mm-hmm.
lawyers working at McDonald's, right?
Sure.
So so the amount of the amount of unemployment that is brought about by a set of conditions in the Spanish economy that have historical roots and so on and so forth has made it so that now labor is weakened relative to capital, and
Mm-hmm.
this means it's also related to the theory of persistent unemployment that if if workers are now in the position to bargain for their wages, they are going to lose a lot of negotiating power in an aggregate sense. And then you're going to end up with lower wages. And in the end, you're going to end up with people not being able to work in certain professions and having to work on others where their pay is much lower. So this is well incorporated into the theory, and this is product of the different struggle between labor and capital within a given economy. So that's why wages are not just subject to a simple, um, a simple competition movement and
Well,
so on and so forth. They are socially determined a lot and historically determined.
well, so the problem with this is that this doesn't actually quite work with like the labor theory of value. So the problem is that the value of labor is supposed to be the fundamental value of labor, I should put it. The way I'd consider it, if you want to put it in like Marxian terms, is the fundamental value of labor power as a commodity should be the amount of labor that is required to reproduce labor. So it takes, I don't know, 20 hours of labor every year to produce enough food to refeed and like recreate the next generation, something along those lines. Anything above that is a shock. It's that social mediation which has driven the wages upwards. And so the problem with this is that using prices of labor commodities, using wages, is not actually a great proxy for the amount of labor it takes to reproduce someone. In fact, what the great trend of history has been that the amount of labor required to reproduce labor has gone down and down and down and down due to increased productivity. Nowadays, only 1 in 100 people in the United States, I think it might be 3 in 100, people in the United States are like agriculture or agriculture related, for example. That used to be 99 out of 100. So the amount, and the reason for that is increased productivity. It's not just because, like, I don't know, somehow the farmers are just producing 30 times more or whatever.
And the problem here again, so the problem is not a problem of the theory at all. I mean, there's something that is well incorporated into the labor theory of value. This is what I was noting about, that necessary value is historically that is the product of class warfare, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
product that any given historical stage of class warfare,
Sure.
and of course of and class warfare occurs within a given social context, within a given set of technological conditions. So like not class war alone doesn't just determine this, but there's a broader context that you also need to take into account, and this is perfectly well. So for example, the
Sure,
necessary amount of
but then
the
it's not that.
necessary
Then it's not the
of
reproduction. Sorry, but then if you're agreeing with this, then it's not the like socially necessary reproductive labor time. It's the like socially determined, the class struggle determined labor value that is going into this.
exactly, and this is the point. It takes, for example, to reproduce a Chinese worker far less in the form of socially necessary labor time
Mm-hmm.
than it takes to reproduce an American worker. That's why wages are much lower in certain sectors, of course, of the Chinese economy, manufacturing sectors in particular, than in the USA. And that's because the conditions there allow for that. In the United States, for example, the amount of power that labor has, even though it's really small relative to other countries, is still, and this is part of why there is a lot of empirical studies being done on the relationship between surplus value and inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And here my thesis is that a lot of inequality can be explained by surplus value, by exploitation. And surplus value depends on necessary value.
So one of the to put this in a historical context, one of the other arguments that Marx made is that we should see either increasing immiseration of the worker or that the workers should be driven to like the wages necessary to sustain themselves and that the capitalists should take more and more of the income as like productivity increases. This
Mhm.
famously has not occurred. Real wages today are 20 times higher than they were in like the 1800s. As a historical note, the economist Robert Allen, who also wrote a very famous book called Farm to Factory about the USSR, so by no means is he like some capitalist scum, he wrote a paper titled The Engels Pause. And what he looks at is real wages in England, 1770 to today, or at least like 1900 or so. One of the things that's really interesting from a historical perspective is the time period when Marx and Engels were writing, especially their early work. Wages had not risen in real terms in England since roughly the 1770s. They were roughly flat until the 1840s. You might be familiar with the 1848 revolutions. Afterwards, there started to be this gradual increase of incomes. And that was the end of the Engels pause. One of the theories for why Marx wrote as he does, why Engels write as they do, is because they were living in this era of non-rising real wages. But that radically changed. Capitalists were
Yeah.
not able to drive down the wages, and workers have been getting more and more of the labor share since roughly 1970 or so.
And that is perfectly well, and the reasons for this can be perfectly well understood within the framework of classical economics and of Marxian economics. So there is no contradiction. So it's true that Marx himself made certain. I mean, so there's question on how much he truly uh,
Mm-hmm.
claimed this or he truly believed this. Okay, but okay, so let's work on the assumption that he really believed that this was going to be the case and that it was going to occur. Okay, I don't really want to enter into that dispute,
Sure.
but okay, so then he was wrong. He was clearly wrong, and there is nothing wrong in seeing why he was wrong. And Malthus, for example, was also wrong on a lot of this issue of immiseration and poverty and so on and so forth. So, but that doesn't mean that the logic of his argument cannot incorporate what really happened in the end. Laborers were able to organize, were able to create movements that allowed them to earn a bigger share of the total product that they were creating.
Mm-hmm.
And this brought about a set of conditions, and then so again, you can look historically at the movements of the rate of profit, and you look at how they look and how they correlate with business cycles and so on and so forth. And there's a really nice theory of business cycles that is drawn from this.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really want to get into that particular subject. So the point here is, it is true that wages are up for struggle, and in every industry there are different conditions. So workers that have a PhD, maybe today in Spain, might not be as valued as they were 30 years ago, or as they are right now in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But that is because they face different conditions. That is because their struggle for wages, for higher wages, or the struggle in terms of the capitalist class for lower wages, is actually leading to that particular outcome. And this is something that Marx already noted, that the struggle for wages brings about different outcomes in different societies in different years, and that it is not necessarily the case that wages need to fall all the time.
So this is one of
So
those things where I think that the intuition you say is valid. It's totally correct. One of the problems, though, again, is kind of appealing back to the old classical tradition and just acknowledging it as a truth without trying to model it. So one of the benefits of
there are
moving.
and Warside does this in to a large extent on when he looks at the theory of persistent unemployment and the struggle of labor in his book. And there are different books that look at a lot of these phenomena at the same time. So I get your concern. Your concern seems to be, why do you need to speak about Adam Smith and David Ricardo and about Marx if these are modern phenomena?
Mhm.
And modernity is good. We should incorporate new things and so forth. And this is something that I completely agree. I mean, I think we should improve over what we have. I think that we should bring about better models, more accurate, that are able to explain more phenomena. And this is part of what scientific progress even means. But
Mhm.
what I'm saying, uh, to some extent, when we're speaking about these issues, we cannot ignore the foundations of these arguments, where they come from, and how well they actually explain the real world. And there are certain problems, of course, and this is things that we can work on and that people have been working on.
Sure. So I don't disagree that I'm sure there are classicals who are trying to add models to this. The question is basically, obviously the first point in this debate was whether the labor theory value had any predictive power. So let's assume for a moment that I totally win on that debate, that the models they're using don't work because of the spurious correlation, and so we shouldn't assume that labor is the key source of value. For the purpose of argument, if this is so, then it seems hard to argue that we should be trying to model these from the base of thinking about things as the labor is being the source of all value, because we have no reason to believe so. Instead, on the demand, on as it were, on the supply side of prices of goods, instead we could think of labor as just one of the costs of production, the factors of production. Labor, like capital and specific types of capital, such as land or specific input goods, all of these things have prices associated with them. And so the modern model for these kinds of things. Sorry, go ahead.
This labor. This is what vertical integration means. Is you take the direct and indirect components of the variable of costs and you reduce them into labor costs.
So, but the problem is the vertical integration of basically how it works is mathematically. How it works is you take an industry, Industry A. Industry A receives 10 units of labor. Then you say, hey, well, 10% of Industry's A output went into Industry B. Okay, well, now 10 times 10% is 1. So we give 1 more unit of labor to Industry B, right? That's the vertical integration. You're literally working through the input-output tables and you see all the sources of labor and all the ultimate outputs of labor. The problem is that doing so isn't useful unless you believe that the labor theory value has predictive capacity. So I'm trying to say, assuming that it doesn't, assuming that Kleeman is correct on this one, that the amount of labor that goes into something is not a great predictor except as one of the input prices, because obviously the price of labor will correlate with the price of the output good. If there's no correlation beyond that, then the question is, why should our theory start from why should it start from using labor as the base, as opposed to just considering labor as one of the many costs of production? And then for the specific cost of labor, we can then just have the normal, like historical models of labor movements, that when labor is strong, prices go up; when labor is weak, prices go down. The same way that it would be like scarcity of like gold or something. When gold is scarce, prices go up. When gold is scarce, is plentiful, it goes down. In short, why should we give special status to labor under the hypothetical that it's not a great predictor?
So you can do that decomposition without assuming anything. In fact, you do that decomposition to see whether or not the theory is correct. So you don't need to assume anything, right? You just need to. So imagine that I produce um, uh, this pencil right here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a direct amount of labor time to produce this pencil, but
Mm-hmm.
it takes some indirect labor time to produce the different components of it. That
Mm-hmm.
is what we need. And we're not making any assumption. The only assumption that we're making is that there is labor that went into the production of the individual components of this pencil.
Mm-hmm.
And then of the individual components of the individual components and so on and so forth. And this is something that we can track with input output tables.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to make any assumption about whether or not at
Well,
this stage about whether or not labor is a determinant of relative prices.
so I want to say I think it's either Kleeman or Romer makes this analogy. You know what like GNI, gross national income, and like GDP are, right?
Mhm.
Or GNP, I suppose, gross national production, right? And so it is very easy to drop a correlation between GNP and GDP. Wow, there's a really strong correlation between GNP and GDP. Just because two things correlate doesn't necessarily tell us anything useful. So one of the problems is if we don't believe that labor has predictive power, then just the fact that we can do so, we can do these vertically integrated labor costs, doesn't necessarily tell us anything useful about how the economy will be structured at the end.
But you need theory. So that's why you need theory. So when you're doing empirical analysis and you're looking at correlation, and depending on the type of empirical analysis that you're doing and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're measuring is distance, but in this case, if you're looking at correlation and so on and so forth, um, the important thing that you need to know is that you need a theory to give you a sense of causation.
Sure.
Okay, and that's why the labor theory. That's what the labor theory of value does. Is it looks at a phenomenon and it says this is the theory behind it,
Sure.
right?
I mean,
And that's what a lot of theories are that's why theory is there. It's to make a sense of the relationships that we see in the data.
mm-hmm.
That's correlation doesn't equal causation, but you need some theory in order to make claims about causation. And in any case, causation is always a thing that you need to pick very carefully because there are
So
always things that can disprove whatever thing you're claiming.
Geo21 says, "Hi Victor, I love your videos." You've got a whole bunch of people in chat who variously said they really appreciate your content. Um, Earlier in this discussion, you mentioned that oftentimes we pick these absurd micro models, microeconomic models. We say this is how this consumer behaves, and then we just extrapolate up from that. And that's like a bad way to go around things. That's the
Mhm.
concern that I have when we operate from the perspective of, hey, labor theory of value is useful because it provides causal interpretation to our findings. Sure, but unless we have good reason to believe that it is a useful theory, like a good reason to predict things in the first place, we shouldn't be trying to use it to imply causation. In short, the way that I think about this is, you've talked to Austrians, I'm sure, occasionally, right?
Of course.
And their big gimmick is that they think that they can axiomatically prove all of their economic theory without using any empirical data. My fear is that when we start with the labor theory value as our theory, because Marx said it, because we're dedicated communists, because we have to follow the line.
But that is not the reason why I take it as a theoretical starting block. I mean, Marx himself didn't take it for that reason. In fact, Marx rejected it for a time until he looked more carefully at the argument in Smith and Ricardo, and he said, "Look, this makes a lot more sense now." Right? Because people change their mind. That's the proper way of approaching any issue in a scientific manner. Is
Mhm.
going with a set of ideas, going with a theory, trying to see whether or not it predicts things in the world and so on and so forth. And it's
Mhm.
also trying to change your mind. So I didn't come. So first of all, I don't want to give the impression, and this is something that I'm some kind of a religious follower of any kind of ideology.
Sure.
The complete opposite, right? I don't assume that at first glance, unless they have provided me with good evidence, that anyone is either. So I don't assume that you are a religious follower of anything
Mm-hmm.
similarly, right? So so I actually didn't believe also in the labor theory of value and in many things for a long part in my life. The thing is, if you have a theory and you bring about certain hypotheses and they have shown to be correct empirically,
Mm-hmm.
then it's not, it's if you have a scientific mind, then it's not a matter of religion to not want to get rid of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are people that might be actually religious on this issue. That's why I want to give an impression. That's why I want to represent an argument that is not religious.
So, um, I feel like so it's been an hour and 45 minutes or so. I feel like this might be like a reasonable part to start wrapping it up a little bit. Also, apparently, you've got a very important soccer game between Madrid and Barcelona.
Atlet- no, it's Atletico Madrid versus Real Madrid.
Oh
It's
my
the
god,
derby, the Madrid derby. Yeah,
there's multiple. I don't
yeah.
look.
It's a thing. It's a thing in Spain. It's a really important game,
Well, I wouldn't
especially
want.
for,
Sorry, I wouldn't
especially
want to
for
keep you
people.
from your game. I apologize for the. I keep over talking you. I think it's probably like a little bit of how long it takes the signal to get between. But I apologize for over talking. Tell us a little about it.
Yeah, I mean, I also apologize because I noticed that I also did that a lot of times. I think there's a little bit of a delay, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why. So I try to look at your face all the time when you're speaking, so that I see if you're making any gesture that you're going to speak, so that I can. But yeah, I mean, there's this problem. But in any way, I know that you don't mean to interrupt me in a rude manner, and I also don't mean that. But it's good.
Well,
So
not
so yeah,
usually anyway. Um, the okay. So I guess why don't we do let's do it like this. So why don't I offer a little closing thought, a short little thing. You can offer a closing thought, and then I will remind you to plug your channel, tell us who you are and where people can get you. So I'll do closing, you'll do closing, and then you'll plug your channel. Reasonable way to close this all up. So
sure.
I guess my appeal to you is I think that when I strongly encourage you to read the Kleeman 2002 paper. It's very light. It's not hard reading. I strongly encourage you to read the what's his name again? Nitzen and Bichler paper. Again, it's pretty light. It's pretty easy reading, and I think it's actually it's not too hard to see it if you physically go to the spreadsheet. You can just play around with it. You can press Control R. You can run it a whole bunch of times, and you can see that the empirical correlations that are in the evidence that we're talking about, the evidence that relies on MAWD, the evidence that relies on this cross-sectoral evidence, just isn't very strong evidence. I like my experience was basically that the reason I'm presenting it is my experience was I read these papers and a lot of my faith in like the authors that I had trusted about this, like Scheich and Cockshot, was shaken because it did seem like their evidence was so weak on this one. They did not use unit prices, they used aggregated prices, and those have two main problems. Fundamentally, one, they're correlating something which is spuriously correlation because everything is multiplied by quantity, I think. I think you'll find it if you read the papers. And two, the very process of aggregating a sector necessarily reduces dispersion, and so the MAWD has a secondary additional problem with results to this. So my plea is basically just read these papers. They aren't too hard to do. I think they're pretty clean, and they explain a pretty simple methodological flaw.
Yeah. Okay. So my point here with regards to that is that um, in input output analysis, this is something that is well accounted for, and that in the studies they do look at unit prices, but they don't look at unit prices in the sense of this particular producer has this
Mm-hmm.
price. They look at in terms of industry wise, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I don't believe presents any methodological flaws. And I would encourage you again to look more carefully at the methodology that is employed in Sheikh, for example, in his book, at the methodology that is employed in different studies done
Mm-hmm.
on Spain, for example. There is a study done on Spain. There is a study done on Sweden. There is another one done on Asian countries. So I would recommend again that you look more carefully into this. You look more carefully into why regression analysis, into why Sheikh believes that regression analysis is not really uh, accurate. Well, it
Mm-hmm.
leads to interpretation flaws with regards to this question.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two more hypotheses that we didn't get the time to discuss: the time series hypothesis and the structural hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
that do in fact also provide strong results with regards to two other hypotheses. One that is that changes in relative prices are going to be explained by, as a time series, are going to be explained by changes in relative labor times, and the structural component, which is relative prices, is going to dominate even in the face of changes in the distribution of profits and wages. And that, taking all of this in aggregate, gives us a good, a strong empirical support for the classical theory of relative prices, which is the theory of value. And that from that initial standpoint, we can get a good understanding of many other phenomena in capitalist societies that is also well empirically supported. And of course, we're relying on the notion of real competition, not on competition uh, as what I calls a ballet, but on competition as war, as struggle. But certain patterns emerge in this struggle, and what we wish to explain is basically why do these patterns come about. And I think that the labor theory of value and different theoretical developments from that initial point give us a good and a strong foundation for this, although there are of course things that should be incorporated. And I think, by the way, that the models that you're referring to, based on imperfect competition, all of them, and so on and so forth, are not do not constitute a sound and strong and cohesive foundation for understanding these phenomena, which is something that Anwar Shaikh as well defends in his book, and I recommend anyone to look at that, because if you take as your starting point perfect competition and then you try to deviate from that, you are, in a sense, you are actually being the one that is surreptitiously being kind of religious, in the sense of you're starting from the ideal world, the Garden of Eden, and then you're moving to, the imperfection caused by our nature or our evil nature, right? And that is, in a sense, the problem that I have with the different methodologies that you alleged. And I believe that real competition, that the foundation based on the classical economists and on post-Keynesian economists as well, and on Keynesian economists, including Keynes himself, who have made certain incorporations and taken their theories, is also good. And we should do a lot more work, and this is part of what I want to do as I move in graduate school, uh, and as I try to become a scholar in economics. This is one of the things that I really want to work on.
Dogs were getting fed.
Yeah, I'm hearing,
Um,
but
yeah. Um, well, thank you again for coming on. I appreciate all of the critiques you've raised, and I hope you appreciated mine. I had a reasonably enjoyable time. Um, would you like to tell us, just again, a little shill at the end, who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
yeah. So again, I'm Victor Magarino. My YouTube channel has my name, where I discuss economic methodology, economic theories, and also some philosophical questions. I study economics and philosophy, but mainly economics at NYU Shanghai, and I've also studied at NYU New York. And my plan is to become a PhD in economics. So hopefully, I'll be able to get to that standpoint. And yeah, my work is basically on that.
Well, perhaps we are now looking at Shike version 2 right here. Thank you again for coming on, and I hope you have a lovely, I guess, evening over there now.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope you have a lovely afternoon too. And it's been good to talk to you, really. Like, I think you've been probably one of the, out of all the conversations, yours has been probably the best. I've really enjoyed it. And we really got into detail and depth on a lot of issues that in other conversations I didn't get the chance. And I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. No, I really enjoyed it as well. All right. Have a lovely afternoon. Oh, God. Aiden is tired. It's only like midday. Okay. So, um, brief summary of my position and what I considered Victor's position. So Victor defending the LTV. The main things that he pointed to were it says I need to request access to the spreadsheet. Oh, did I not set up that correctly? Let me do that real quick. Share can open. Change to anyone with the link. Anyone with the link can view. Copy link. That dude did have some good drip. Oh, I don't think, maybe you can't. No, you can still reload it, but I don't think you can do it as quickly because, yeah. What you can do if you want to play around with this a little bit more quickly is, I don't want to do it here because if I show you it in Excel, I think it will show my name. But if you go download as an Excel, then you can press F9, the reload button in Excel, and like rapidly reload it. And what you can see is, well, let me do the summary first before I get to the sheet. So Victor defended the LTV. There's two main schools that defend LTV. One is called the TSSI. Kleeman is a big fan of the TSSI. I'm not a big fan of either LTV, but Kleeman's a big fan of the TSSI, and he is not a big fan of the other one, which is what I call the relative price interpretation. The long and short of it is that the relative price interpretation asserts that there's a really good correlation between the integrated amount of labor that goes into a sector and the total value of that sector. So what they do there is like what Scheik does, which is what he's referencing, a man named Anwar Scheik, who wrote the book called Capitalism, Competition, and Crises. I think that's the name. Oh, wrong one. Over here. Yep, Scheik, 2016. Capitalism, Competition, and Crises. Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crises. Ah, there we go. It's a long one. It's basically the culmination of his like 30 years of work, and it's his argument as to like how you should structure economics from a classical perspective. He was the first one to publish studies of this kind, and what he does is he shows tables like, for example, this one, which does a measure called the MAWD, or mean average weighted deviation. And it shows that the amount of labor that goes into a given sector and the market price of the outputs of that sector, sorry, how do I put this? The deviation between the two is very small. So first, they show that there's very strong correlation. You put in like 100 labor, you get out 100 value. Oh, seems pretty good. They also show that the one predicts the other reasonably well when it comes to distribution. So there's very little deviation that they start the deviation beyond beyond prices, for example, is around like 0.09 or so. And so this suggests labor theory value true. This was like the big research wave in the 1980s. Then what happened is Kleeman. So that's the person that I was presenting. And Kleeman asserted that this correlation is spurious. The basic reasoning behind this logic is that when they, I'm just getting the results up. So for the first thing Kleeman does, he gets a data set and replicates exactly what Scheik does. He replicates a data set where the MAWD, the same thing that Scheik is using, was 8%. So pretty small. Labor theory value, if we're using Scheik's definition, seems to work. Problem, however, there might be spurious correlation because big sectors employ more labor and have higher prices, but we aren't interested in looking at the total amount of labor. We're interested in looking at the unit cost of labor. The labor theory value does not just predict that the entire shoemaking industry will have like a total value pretty close to that of like the labor theory value. We're interested in saying that an individual shoe is strongly predicted by the amount of labor that went into that shoe. So you've got to account for the size of an industry. Otherwise, you're going to have a spurious correlation. The basic reason why this occurs is, let's say you've got two lists, what would we call vectors. And the vector one is like the price of a given industry, like how much value it put out. And vector two is how much labor went into that industry. Any vectors you take, if you multiply both of them by a third vector called quantity, then these new multiplied vectors will correlate with each other. I believe he shows this. He explains this here, I believe. I could have sworn that there was a better quote to explain this. Regardless, the basic point is that if you multiply both vectors by Q, quantity, Kleeman believes there will be spurious correlation. And in fact, there is, which is what Nitzan demonstrates, which I'll get to in a moment. That's why I have the spreadsheet up. So after you remove the size of a sector, which he does by dividing a sector by the cost of its inputs, the cost of labor and non-labor inputs, which seems like a rough proxy for the size of a sector, right? Like if your sector has to spend $1 billion in costs and makes $1.1 billion in revenue, then dividing that gets you roughly like the amount of, it gets you something like value per year or something. And it's going to be accounting for the fact that some sectors are much larger than others. There are other ways that you could try to reduce for the size of a sector, but this is the one that we actually have good data on. So once you do that, the correlation, it's not that one. The correlation is very weak. That's what I was talking about here. The R squared, which roughly indicates the percent of variation in price of a sector that can be predicted by labor inputs to that sector, is 0.005, which roughly equates to 0.5%. So if labor goes up, then labor can only explain like 0.5% of the variation of going up or going down in the actual price of a sector. A low R squared basically means that things are very uncorrelated and that one doesn't explain the others very well. So this is not good for the labor theory value because it suggests that labor is not very predictive of prices. That's why this article is, this spreadsheet is so useful, because you can just run it yourself. Like I tried to explain, what Nitzlin and Bichler do is they have 20 sectors. Then for each sector, they give it a quantity. And they make these quantities increase in size. So you have some very small sectors, like sector 1, which produces 1 value of goods. And let's make it increase by 2, right? Just to prove that you can do this. So B4 times 2, let's drag it out. Now, the smallest sector produces 1 unit, and the biggest sector, sector 20, produces 2 to the 20 units. Or that looks like what? 524,288 goods. Now, what are the price of those goods? P is the price of the good, and V is the value of those goods. So this made-up economy, these simulated values are explicitly made to be spurious. If you look at the equation, it says 10 times rand. That means that it's just picking a random number. I don't actually know what the range for rand is. I want to say it's like 0 to 1 or something, but I don't actually recall. Basically, it's a random number, and if you take 2 random numbers, there should be no reason that they're correlated with each other. If you pick 1 to 10 out of a hat, and some other guy picks 1 to 10 out of a hat, there should be no correlation between which numbers you picked, and that's exactly what you find. Number 1 here is unit price versus unit value. As you can see, there's some that have very low on both, some that have very high on both, but there's overall no correlation. There's no like nice line of dots going through. But if instead you do what Scheik does and what Cockshot does, and you look at Q times P, the total price of a sector, the total output of a sector, or you look at the total labor inputs to a sector, then because you've multiplied everything by Q, there is a very nice linear relationship. Basically what you've done is take this graph, and for each dot, you've like pushed it upwards, multiplied it by Q, and that necessarily linearizes it. So this results in a spurious correlation. You cannot take this result as valid unless you find some way to get rid of Q. That's the long and short of it. And the proof for it is, you just reload. Oh, look, still linear. Oh, look, still linear. Oh, look, still linear. But every time, there's been no correlation between unit price and unit value. In fact, you can even set it up such that unit price and unit value are negatively related, that the more labor you put into something, the less it gets out, and it would still randomly correlate. It would still correlate because of the importance of multiplying by Q. So, that's about it. Basically, I think this demolishes the main argument for this version of labor theory value, and without that, you should abandon the theory. There's no empirical evidence for it. I do not have any discussion about TSSI. I need to do more reading about like TSSI basically, but this was the labor theory value that got me into it because it had a lot of empirical evidence, and the empirical evidence also got me out of it. So Leftist Garrett said, "Why did the oil sector deviate so much then on that one cockshot video?" This sector is just totally random. In the real world, certain sectors, Cockshot argues, are like their value comes from land rents and monopoly power and not due to competition, and so labor theory value doesn't actually apply. So the recap, the very short recap is I used to believe in LTV. I used to like Scheich. I used to like Cockshot's arguments about this. Their argument was called a cross-sectional analysis, which showed that the amount of labor going into something and the output of a given sector was highly correlated. So it's this nice line where the dots go up and up and up, and they're like a nice line on a nice little line. Turns out this is spurious. Big sectors have a lot of labor inputs and a lot of output. You need to address for the fact that some sectors are bigger than others. So the evidence is weak. You shouldn't believe in this theory just because of it. Therefore, I prefer the more economically mainstream idea of just a general equilibrium model, that on both the supply and the demand, the price of a good is determined by the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal desire to purchase a good, and on the other hand, by the marginal, I guess you could call it scarcity, the marginal availability, the marginal price of the factors of production. So, long and short of it, I think that the mainstream economics one is a better explanator here because it's basically labor theory value, but it has a lot more predictive capacity. General equilibrium is not accurate, though. I understand that the model has a lot of, there are critiques of that as well, but the critiques there are going to be the same critiques you could raise against the labor theory of value, that things don't actually arrive at their natural conclusion or something along those lines. Are you saying that LTV didn't account for scale? Not that LTV itself doesn't account for scale, that the evidence for LTV didn't account for scale. So yes. Brian says, watch Steve Keen. So I'm not trying to defend mainstream economics as totally flawless or whatever. There are lots and lots and lots of people who will present critiques of this idea that we all just naturally, the market just comes to this perfect equilibrium. In reality, most markets are highly flawed. So there's a reason they don't come to equilibrium. The idea is that the model for how things work is general equilibrium. Akin to the way that the model of how things works is LTV, and then we allow for shocks to both of these models. Yeah, that's basically it. Oh, the other concluding point here is you don't need, I am also on Twitch, yes. You don't need to believe that labor theory value to believe that exploitation occurs. If you want to stay in Marxian economics, you still want to have the big capital M next to your name. You want to have the street cred among the communists. The book that I strongly recommend is Roemer, who is a market socialist, but who also produced this lovely book called Free to Lose, an introduction to Marxist economic philosophy. I legally purchased this book, of course, which I have right here. And you can see that in the very beginning, Roemer notes that students who wish to learn Marxist economics, for the most part, must master a language that is a century old and not visibly compatible with what they read in contemporary social science. My aim in this book is to present the lasting ideas of Marxist economics in a way that makes them accessible to readers today. But it would be dishonest to say that only the language is new. Many classic Marxist arguments do not appear here or have been drastically revised because I believe they are wrong. The two that he names are the theory of the falling rate of profit and the labor theory of value. So important in the classic Marxist account is unimportant here because it contributes nothing to our understanding, and even when it is most charitably interpreted, is at best misleading. He presents more or less Marxian economics without using either of these theories. So, you want to stay Marxian? Stay in this model. Roemer. You can still explain exploitation even in a Marxian context without using the labor theory of value. It presents you all the benefits of doing the whole Marxian stuff where you care a whole bunch about workers being exploited without having to tie you to the baggage of defending the labor theory of value.
I love you.
If you would like to go to B-OK, the link is in the description. Now, I don't know that I'd even call myself a Marxian in this respect anymore. I think that I would probably fall slightly further to the right on economic stuff, as it were. However, if you want to stay in the Marxian area, Roemer is the guy. Jonas Convald, where is this Q factor coming from again? So in the spreadsheet, there are basically three things that come into it. Let's say that you had data on each individual firm and you knew the unit price, and that firm only sold one product. So it's like the shoe store and they sell, 10 shoes, and you know that the cost of every shoe is $1 and the value that goes into each shoe, the labor that goes into each shoe is 4.6. That's not the actual data that we're working with. the data that we have is aggregated by sector. It's called an input-output table. Basically, it adds up everything in a given sector, which is probably something like clothing. And we average all the clothing out. And so what we get is, sorry, we don't average it, we sum it up. And so what happens is, therefore, you multiply the quantity times the price to get the total output and the total price. As a result, you get this spurious correlation. Q is quantity. Why did so many people come in? Brian, what do you think of Keynesian economics? Modern Keynesian economics is either new Keynesian, which is more right-wing, or like post-Keynesianism, which is more left-wing and focuses a lot on like behavioral economics and failed, or on market failures, on like imperfect markets. Watch Steve Keen. I do need to read a little bit more about modern monetary theory. Virtually everyone that I've heard talks about it talks about it in the negative context. Did you watch Cockshot's video critiquing market socialism? In fact, I did. And that video, if you want to watch it on Twitch, it's in my VODs. And if you want to watch it on YouTube, you can wait until the 15th of December, I think. Okay. I think, is there a compiled list of the sources you used here? I guess I could, here, one moment.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
I could probably go to, where would I have it? Labor Theory of Value, upload to Discord. Thanks again for the conversation. Here are the sources I cited. Have a lovely weekend. Then I can link this. If you'd like to download the document, you can. And in the long run, I'm actually going to move all this back into the big stinky right-winger fact sheet, which you can find on my website. If you click the link here, it'll take you to my website. If you want the HTML version, which is formatted, so you can like open and close sources. Or if you are a hardcore SDL fan, you can go get the text version, which is what I actually use. That's about it. All right, sure. Oh, yes. Libri Nation, I read Noah Smith's point about the MMT models, and I very much like Noah Smith's blog on it. But the problem is that I haven't read the MMT models myself, so I'm getting a one-sided view. I need to read. I can't say that I'm being fair if I've only read one side, right? Sir Komodo says, so at higher values, Q takes over and the original discrepancies get smoothed out from afar. Yes. That is exactly it. Like, let's say, basically the way would be like, let's say that unit price goes down as labor goes up. So we get something like, I don't know. Wait, can I not edit this? Why can't I edit it? Isn't this me? Oh, it's in my incognito. Let's say we want to make it like 20. Oh, wait, I shouldn't do this. This will mess up the sheet. One moment. File, make a copy. Let's say we wanted to have it go down, and we wanted a negative correlation between these two.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
What you'll notice is even though
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Even though unit price and value are inversely related, as unit value goes up, labor input goes down.
I love you.
Why are a whole bunch of people following? Oh, Denims is rating. Hey, Denims, I really appreciate you coming in. This is like the end of a very boring economic discussion. So I'm not actually doing anything very fun at the moment. I think I was going to go respond to a video called Islamic Pulse about like LGBT. So it's like a really stupid video if I have any expertise on the previous one. So to summarize, to close up my point about the labor theory of value stuff, you can set up a situation where the price of a good actually negatively correlates with the value of a good. And if you look at total price versus total value, there's still a positive correlation because looking from afar, Q times P and Q times V still correlate spuriously. That's the basic take. Oh, and if any of you want to follow, because Denims is one of the I really liked Denims. I really liked your stream.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
you should follow me because I'm a big brain and Denims is a big brain, and your parasocial relationship with Denims, the fact that you're friends with Denims, actually you should be a friend with me too, okay? Because I've watched her stream and I'm a parasocial friend of her, therefore she's a friend of me. My narco denimism must be spread. I'm pretty sure denim is still like a sock dem.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Infinite regression. Can you send in the Nitzlin and Bitchler spreadsheet? I think I did. Should be here. Denim says, I'm a sockdem and proud. I'm pretty sure on Twitter you said that you're a sockdem, but you're you're somewhat moving to like anti-capitalism sort of stuff. So you're getting close enough, okay? You're almost based. We are all parasocially related. Good point. Thanks again for the raid. I'm gonna probably gonna pee. Let me keep up the Shike tab. I'm probably gonna pee, and then I'm gonna review. I think it was what is it?
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Machinations 7 Islamic Pulse. Someone wanted me to review these videos. Oh my god, so many of you are following. Holy shit. Oh no, Denim said, I'm going to be doing some socialism research today, and then sends 2 woo guillotines. Holy shit. Yikes. I'm not even a guillotiner. I'm like a reformist, okay? We're gonna take the bourgeois and we're gonna tax them, okay? That's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna radically tax them and take it away, okay?
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Oh my god, so many people are following. Do I need to like turn this off or something? Yeah, we're just gonna tax them. We don't need to cut off their heads to take away their money.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Leah, you are very generous. I appreciate it. So this is the one I watched previously.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
This one was really funny because their big argument was that the LGBT people are forcing their way in on society, and they're like they're like doing hate speech laws, and hate speech is just going too far. And their example of the person who they said the law like went too far for was this guy who on live TV. It's this one at the end.
Anyone who is not heterosexual should die, correct? Absolutely, of course.
The example of the person they said that hate speech laws went too far on. To be clear, in the United States, we don't actually have any hate speech laws. The example of the guy they said hate speech laws went too far on is this guy who on live TV is saying homosexuals should be killed. His channel is like a joke, but it has like 50,000 subs, so might as well come at it, I guess. All right, I'm gonna pee.